So to start, last time we were talking about sensation and perception, and we talked about really what I would call sensation mostly last week. So sensation is essentially when your sense organ receives the information from the environment. So we talked quite a bit about vision, how the light, hits the photoreceptors in the retina, and then your brain kind of starts processing the information from there. So that process of just receiving the energy from the environment is sensation. And then perception is where our brain takes that energy and starts to try to interpret it and make sense of it in a way that we can actually interact with the environment or get useful information from it. So today we're talking more about that kind of perceptual level of how we recognize objects. So some of the main things I want you to take away from today, number one is that recognizing objects in our environment is a much more complex process than it seems. It seems like it's just this really simple thing because we do it very quickly, we do it automatically, we can look all around the world and just immediately recognize every single thing that we see. But it's actually a very complex process when you start to break down kind of the steps that are necessary to do it successfully. We're going to talk about a few different theories of object recognition, and I'm going to talk about it kind of like historically. There's three main types of theories that have been proposed. So we're going to start with kind of the earliest ones. We'll talk about some of the issues that those theories had, and then we'll get to kind of modern day theories that have at least less issues with them. So the best theories take all that complexity into account that we'll talk about in just a minute. Then we'll also talk about this idea that there are kind of different types of recognition. So generally, things like face recognition are going to be a little bit different from other types of more general object recognition. So we'll talk about some of those differences towards the end. So to start, some of the things that are kind of amazing about our ability to recognize objects that we all just take for granted, we probably never really stop and think about. Number one is that we can recognize novel objects that we have never seen before. So like you've probably never seen this specific pen before, but I hold it up and you're going to immediately recognize that's a pen even though you've never seen this one before. I can look out in the room and recognize, water bottles and cups and laptops, even though I've never seen that specific one before. So somehow our brain's taking information from all this history of things we've seen and figuring out what this novel object is. We can also recognize objects that are partially occluded, which means objects that are covered up in some way. So again, as I look out in the room, there's chairs, but they're covered by like tables or they're covered by your laptops. And even if I can see just a little portion of the chair, I can still recognize it, even though I can't see the whole thing. We can also recognize objects from any angle or distance. So again, as I walk around the room, like if I'm looking at that chair, the actual image that's projected to my retina is constantly changing. If I'm looking at it from different angles or I back up, it's going to be a little bit smaller. I go towards it, it's going to be a little bit bigger. And yet, even with all those changes happening, I can still recognize exactly what it is. And we can do all of this very, very quickly. Like it's just ridiculously fast how quickly we can recognize objects. I have a little demo to kind of demonstrate this. So on the next slide, you're going to see basically a bunch of very simple line drawings are going to flash really quickly. So I have them set in PowerPoint to where they'll flash for like a half second each. And all I want you to do is just raise your hand when you see a snail.
A snail?
A snail. All right. Everybody ready for this? All right, there you go. If you blinked, you would have missed it because it's literally like less than half a second. So again, like that line drawing, very simple information. You don't need to have color or shading or anything, but just based on a tiny simple line drawing, half a second, your brain can immediately recognize what that is. Now it did take maybe just like a little bit of time for your brain to be like, okay, that's a snail, I need to raise my hand, and then your hand to go up. But just recognizing it, you only needed half a second of information to do it. We can do it again, just in case anyone missed the snail. So now raise your hand for the comb. Somebody's hand went up before it, so someone's got ESP here. There was. I think there was something that had like kind of parallel lines that, yeah, tricked you a little bit. But the point is, it's ridiculously fast that we can do this. And I think one of the main things that kind of proves how complex human object recognition really is the fact that for decades, we've been trying to write algorithms that can do what we do, that can recognize objects as quickly as we can across all these different conditions. And we're getting much closer, for sure. But I would say we're still not there. There still is not an algorithm that can recognize objects as quickly and as accurately as humans can. There are some that can do like specific classes of objects. So like, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, things like that probably have really good face recognition algorithms where you can upload a picture of you and your friends and it can identify who you and your friends are and tag them. Although usually that's probably going to take more than half a second for it to do that. And also if you take that same algorithm and try to apply it to a bunch of other things, you try to get it to recognize pens and tables and chairs and everything else, it's probably not going to do a very good job at it. So the fact that we can't write an algorithm to do it as well as humans is a pretty good piece of evidence that it's much more complex than it seems in just kind of our day-to-day lives as we're, again, sort of exploring the world, trying to interact. Okay, so let's talk about a couple theories that have tried to explain how human object recognition works. And we're going to start with a couple of theories that I'll just, like, spoiler alert, they're going to be wrong. So we're going to talk about them a little bit, we'll talk about why they're wrong, and then we'll get to the better theory, which still also has some issues with it as well. So I will say, too, we have not come anywhere close to answering all the questions about how we recognize objects. There's still a lot we don't know. So some of the earliest theories that researchers in cognitive psychology proposed are what are called template theories. And template theories basically suggest that for every object that we are capable of recognizing, we have like a little template stored in our mind somehow. Almost you can imagine like we have a little like archive of just lots of different pictures that are stored in our memory. And so whenever I encounter an object in the world, I see a pen or whatever, for me to recognize that, I'm basically going to take that image and compare it to all these images I have stored in memory and find the one that's the closest match. So in my memory, I might have pictures of dogs and chairs and cups and faces. And I'm just going to take this image, compare it to all of those, and find the one that matches most closely. So, I mean, I have a slide kind of depicting that. So let's say that I am out in the world and I see this thing. And then in my memory, I have all these templates of other things stored. Then I'm just kind of like compare how much does this thing that I'm seeing overlap with all these templates I have in memory. And then the one that has the highest match, I'm going to say, okay, well, it must be that thing, which in this case is a coffee mug. So yeah, this was like the earliest theories. Maybe seems like intuitive at first, but it does not explain any of the things I just talked about at all. So number one, it cannot explain how we would recognize novel objects. So if I don't have a template stored in memory for a thing because I've never seen that thing before, then how would I have anything to compare it to? How would I recognize it? So it can't really explain how we can identify novel objects. It can't explain how we can identify occluded objects because that's going to disrupt that image, right? Like right now I'm looking at the chair. If I'm trying to figure out what it is and I'm trying to compare that to things in memory, then none of my chairs in my memory are going to be occluded in the exact same way. Like the table's not going to cover in the same spot, or the table that's covering it might be different. So it doesn't explain that very well. And it also isn't very good at explaining how we can view objects from multiple perspectives. So if I had a coffee mug that I'm looking at from like straight on where the handle's like perfectly off to the side, and then I'm comparing that to a template in memory, maybe my template in memory has the mug like rotated to where the handle is behind it, where I can't see it. So then I'm comparing it to something at a different angle. That doesn't work very well either. Now there are ways to fix all those problems. I could, for example, have a template for every angle of a coffee mug. So not just one template of a coffee mug, but maybe like 60 templates that just have it, rotated at all different angles. I could have a bunch of templates where they're included, etc. But the main issue with this one is that the amount of time that it would take for my brain to kind of sort through all those templates and make those comparisons would be an extremely long amount of time. right? If I tried to write a computer algorithm that followed this theory, it would run very, very slowly. And like I said, probably wouldn't be able to recognize objects under all these conditions. So it's maybe the most intuitive theory, like on its face, but as soon as you just think about it a little bit, it pretty much crumbles and is not a great theory. So I would say there are very rare cases where computer algorithms do work based off of template theories. So for example, like a barcode scanner at a grocery store, that is scanning for a very specific exact template of a particular barcode, and then comparing that to a whole archive of barcodes and matching it up with like whatever it is you're buying from the grocery store. So that would be an example of where template theory works, but you can't take that outside of that very specific context because it's not going to work anywhere else. Okay, so then kind of in response to template theories, researchers came up with a second class of theories called feature theories. So this one says that in our memory, we have all these representations of objects that are stored as like lists of features. So they're lists of features that describe the object. So for example, like a coffee mug, maybe I have a list of features that describe it as like a cylinder and a curve. Okay. So instead of a picture, it's like that verbal description, basically. But then kind of the same thing, the target object's features. If I see a coffee mug out in the real world, then my brain's going to classify that as like, okay, there's a cylinder and there's a curve. Let me sort through my memory and find the things that have a cylinder and a curve and compare it to that. So it could be something like this, too. This is just a slightly different way of saying it. So in this case, this coffee mug has 2 straight edges, and then it has 4 curved edges. So the top and the bottom, and then each side of the handle. So there's the straight lines and the curved lines. So again, I would maybe go through my memory and try to find what are all the things I have stored in memory that have 2 straight edges and 4 curved edges. So the issue with this one is that it will incorrectly categorize scrambled versions of an object as sort of fitting together. So essentially I could take those features I just talked about and put them in kind of any arrangement or order, and my brain would classify all those things as a coffee mug, even though in a lot of instances they would very clearly not be a coffee mug. So for example, here I have just kind of the outline of that coffee mug. Again, we've got 2 straight edges and 1, 2, 3, 4 curved edges. But if I were to just move the arrangement of this a little bit and put some of those curved edges on top, then now I have something that most people would probably call like a bucket or a pail instead of a coffee mug. And yet, if I was using this system, that would still have 2 straight edges and 4 curved edges. So my brain would still classify that as a coffee mug, if this theory was correct, which obviously it's not. So template theories aren't very good at recognizing objects. Feature theories aren't very good at recognizing objects. So then the most modern theories that solve a lot of these problems are called structural description theories. And really, a structural description theory is just kind of an evolution of the feature theory. It's taking the good things about the feature theory, but just making it a little bit better. So structural description theories add a really important part, which is called the relations among the features. So instead of just coding the features themselves, it's the features plus how do they relate to each other. And relation could mean a lot of things. It could mean like the positioning of them. So in this case, let's just to simplify, we're going to call it a cylinder. We're going to call this handle a curved cylinder. And we're going to add this important relation that they're to the side of each other. Cylinder to the side of a curved cylinder. So position is one kind of relation. Another kind of relation we could add would be like relative size. So this curved cylinder is smaller than the main cylinder. We could also add like angle, like are they parallel, are they oblique? But that gives us essentially all the information we need to know to recognize now that this is a coffee mug. That eliminates that possibility that you're going to falsely recognize a bucket or a pail as being a coffee cup. So kind of an easy, simplified way to summarize these. Template theories say that we store images of objects in our brain, in our mind. They essentially recognize too few objects because they will not correctly recognize novel objects. They won't recognize objects that are included or objects from different angles. Feature theories store the information as lists of features, and they tend to recognize too many objects as fitting a category. So they would recognize not just a coffee cup, but also something like a bucket as being in the same category. Structural description theories have the list of features, but they also have the relations among the features, and they typically will recognize, objects most accurately. They will recognize coffee mugs as coffee mugs, but buckets as buckets, and put those as separate things. All that making sense so far? Now, we do still have an issue, though, with structural description theories. And kind of the concise way to say it is that any two things that have the same description you wouldn't be able to distinguish them based on this theory. So, for example, according to structural description theory, like all faces, the way we would maybe represent them in our mind would be something like you have two eyes above a nose, which is above a mouth. We might also store a little bit of information about like size, etc. But with that description, we wouldn't really be able to tell different faces apart. I wouldn't be able to look out at all of you right now and be able to distinguish all your faces because all of you have two eyes above a nose above a mouth, right? So structural description theories are really good for like kind of basic categorizing of objects. It's good for saying that's a coffee mug. It's good for me saying all of you have human faces. But it's not good when you want to do those more precise distinctions between things like within a category. So if I want to tell the difference between my coffee mug and your coffee mug, my face and your face, then I need to switch to a separate system. So structural description theories cannot handle all types of recognition. But the interesting thing is that we have lots of evidence that we actually have two different systems for recognizing things. So the first system is essentially everything I just described with structural description theories. The important thing is that they use really like broad categorical information for relations. So like when I was talking about the coffee mug, there's the cylinder, to the side is the curved cylinder. I could be way more precise about that. Instead of just saying it's to the side, I could say that the handle is like 2 centimeters wide, and so it's set off 2 centimeters from the cylinder or whatever. So I could be much more precise. The issue with that, though, is that, again, if I rotate the mug, if I'm looking at it from different angles, or if I have a slightly different coffee mug, then that precise, 2 centimeter distance is going to be different from coffee mug to coffee mug. Make sense so far? So if I just use this broad category of to the side, then that captures every coffee mug. So you've got this categorical system that's really good for just that basic level object recognition. But then when you need to do these finer distinctions, when you need to tell the difference between two people's faces, for example, you're going to switch to this other system, calling it the metric system, which is maybe confusing because we have the metric system of centimeters and meters. That's not what I mean here. I just mean it's more precise. So you switch to this more precise system that actually does try to capture every little detail of these relations among features. So you can think of this more precise system as almost like we're going to lay graph paper over the face, and we're going to plot out the very specific coordinates of where each feature is. So instead of just saying the eyes are above the nose and those are above the mouth, we might sort of code it as this eye is at, whatever, 1.5 and 3, and this one is at 2.5 and 3. We're going to plot the exact coordinates of each feature. And so if you look from face to face, those very precise little distances are going to be different for every person. So the next slide says basically the same thing, just in words and a little more concise. So we've got two systems, one system for basic object recognition, and a more precise system anytime we have to distinguish things that have the same structural description. The other thing I'll say about the second system, the one we use to recognize faces, typically it's going to be more cumbersome for our brain. It's going to take more time. It's going to take more resources. It takes more computation. So the first system that uses categories, where you can just recognize a coffee mug as a coffee mug, that's very fast. The second one takes a little bit more time to work, basically. Okay, so kind of the fix to this is to say we have two systems, but now I need to show you the evidence that proves that that's actually the case. So there's quite a few pieces of evidence. Some of them come from cognitive psychology, from like behavioral studies, where we basically test the way that people respond to different types of objects. And then we also have evidence from neuroscience, from the way that our brain, functions, basically. So one of the pieces of evidence that we have these two different systems for objects and faces is what's called the inversion effect. And the inversion effect just refers to the fact that if you flip a face upside down, it's going to be very difficult to recognize, and it's going to take a lot longer for your brain to recognize it. But if you flip an object upside down, typically you don't have that same effect. You can still recognize it just as quickly and just as easily. So here's an object upside down. You can tell immediately that's a chair. If this was an actual experiment, the way that it would work is you would get this image flashed on the screen very quickly, usually for like half a second, kind of like we did with the line drawings. And then you would have to type in your response of what the object is. So you would see this flashed, and then you would have to type chair or whatever. And then the thing that we would be measuring would be reaction time. So often there might be like a button you push as soon as you recognize it, and then you put in your answer. And then the same thing with the face that we'll see in just a second. As soon as you recognize the face, you would push a button, and then you would type in your answer of who that face belongs to. And what we would see is that your reaction time for responding to an upside-down face is much slower than your reaction time for responding to an upright face. So there's this big discrepancy. But for objects, reaction time is going to be pretty much equal, whether it's upside down or right side up. So next one is a face. This was obviously a chair, but if you recognize the face, I want you to just raise your hand as soon as you do. Some of you aren't sure. Even those of you that raised your hand pretty quickly, it took probably longer than it would for the chair. Who do you think it is?
I forget her real name, but she plays Jessica Day.
Yes, in
Yeah.
yeah. So her name's Zooey Deschanel. People often confuse her with Katy Perry. I think if you had said Katy Perry, I almost would give it to you because they look pretty much the same. So yeah. Okay, I'm going to show you another one. This one I want you to raise your hand again when you recognize the face. All right, that one was quick, but now I'm just going to take this picture and turn it right side up. And now he's very creepy looking, right? So this is called a Thatcherized face. So basically to make this, all I did is I took the eyes and the mouth and turned them upside down. So then if I take that whole image and turn it upside down, I would go back, but it'll mess up my recording. But oftentimes when you have the Thatcherized face upside down, people don't even realize that something looks off or weird. It looks pretty normal until you turn it right side up, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, that's weird looking. And so really what all this says is that there's something about the way that we process faces that's disrupted by rotating it. But with objects, that's not disrupted because they're using two totally different systems. Okay? We could go into a lot more detail about why turning a face upside down matters so much, etc., but that would take quite a bit of time, so I'm going to not do that today. If you're interested, come talk to me, and I'll explain it. But kind of similar, there's also what's called the photonegative effect. So if you take an object and you show the photonegative, which is where you just inverse all the colors, so black becomes white, white becomes black, etc., then it's still very easy to recognize an object in that case, but it's difficult to recognize faces when they're a photonegative. And again, the thing we would most likely register here is reaction time, like how fast do you recognize the object versus the face if it's a photonegative. So here's an object. That is a landline phone. I need to update this maybe because maybe some of you have never seen a landline phone. It's very possible, but you can recognize that very quickly. So again, I'm going to show you the face, and I want you to just raise your hand when you recognize who the face belongs to. So that is Daniel Radcliffe, who plays Harry Potter. This is the regular.
I recognize him. I
Okay, yeah. What is his name? Aaron Paul
Yeah.
or something? Yeah. Nope, yeah, so that is Daniel Radcliffe. So yeah, whenever it's a photonegative of the face, it's often very difficult to recognize. If you do recognize it, it often takes like more time for your brain to kind of process. So again, just showing there's two different systems. One's disrupted by this photonegative effect, the other one is not, because they're two totally different systems. So now let's get into a little bit of the neuroscientific evidence. So for this part to make sense, you've got to kind of understand, we talked about this last time, but just to remind you, things in your left visual field are processed in the right side of the brain, and things in the right visual field are processed in the left side of the brain. That can get tricky when we're talking about things like this. But there's evidence that when a face is presented in our left visual field, which means it's going to the right side of the brain, we're able to process it more quickly, and we're able to better process things like emotional expressions and stuff like that. Whereas with objects, we can recognize them equally regardless of which hemisphere they're in. So we have this advantage where it seems like the right hemisphere of the brain is really specific to processing faces, whereas with objects, you know, both parts function equally. We'll talk more in a second about the precise different areas of the brain. But here's again an example of kind of what I was talking about earlier. Now this works best if you're like right in the middle of the projector. If you're off to one side, it's not going to work as well. But if we look at these images, image A and image B, I want you to think about which one looks happier. So how many of you think image A looks happier? How many of you think image B looks happier? Okay. So, yeah. And again, it kind of matters, like for it to work, you need to be right in the middle of the screen, and so that this goes to your left visual field and that goes to your right or whatever. But basically, if you look at image A, we have this neutral side of the face. So spoiler alert, they're the exact same picture, just mirrored. So there's no good reason necessarily that, like, or the mouth is mirrored at least. Everything else is the same. So in this one, we've got the neutral face is in your left visual field going to the right side of your brain. So your brain is prioritizing processing that part of the face. So your brain thinks like, okay, this looks pretty neutral. Whereas in image B, it's the opposite. It's the smiling part is going to the face recognition part of your brain. So you recognize that smile more quickly. This is also the reason, so how many of you prefer, like if you look at yourself in the mirror versus looking at yourself in a photo, how many of you feel like you look better typically looking in the mirror? How many of you feel like you look better typically looking at a photo of yourself? And so this is due to the same thing. So if you look at a mirror, your image is being reflected. So the left side of your face is going to be on the left, which is going to go to the right side of your brain. So when you look in a mirror, you're mostly processing the left side of your face. In a photo, it's going to be flipped. You take a picture of yourself, as long as you're not using selfie mode at least. It's going to flip that so that in a picture, you're processing the right side of your face. And obviously, there's like subtle differences between each side of our face, unless you're like perfectly symmetrical, which congratulations if that's the case, because that's one of the main indicators of attractiveness. But yeah, so you're just processing different parts of your face. The kind of bad news is that everyone else sees you the way that you appear in photos. Because everyone else, if they look at you, they're processing the right side of your face instead of the left. Good news though, the only reason the photo looks weird to you is because most people, you look at yourself in the mirror typically more often than a picture. Because like you get ready every day, you brush your teeth every day, you spend a decent amount of time looking at yourself in a mirror. You probably don't spend as much time looking at yourself in photos. So really the only reason the picture looks weird is just because you're not used to it. So people who see you every day, they're used to seeing your face the way that they see it. So to them, it probably doesn't look nearly as weird as you think you look in a picture. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're processing faces mostly in the right side of the brain. Objects get processed in both sides of the brain equally. And then we can get even more specific. There are very specific areas of the brain that process objects versus faces, or more like these more distinct, sort of distinguishing between objects of the same class. So, anybody recognize anything in this picture? It's a very weird picture. It's very unsettling to me because it basically depicts what it would be like to have something called agnosia. So agnosia can result from damage to this very specific part of the brain called the inferior temporal cortex. So we talked a little bit about this last time, but from the retina, information goes to the thalamus. It eventually goes back to the occipital lobe, to the primary visual cortex. And really the primary visual cortex is just kind of figuring out like basic shapes. It's figuring out where all the boundaries of objects are and maybe starting to figure out like that's rectangular, that's a circle, or whatever. If you move just a little bit forward in that, the lower pathway we talked about last time, you get to a part that's really good at identifying objects. So this part of the brain will be really active whenever you're trying to figure out what something is. Is that a chair, is that a table, or whatever. If you have damage to this part, then that can give you agnosia. Someone with agnosia, the world would kind of look like this to them. So they have, their eyes are perfectly functioning, they can see, and they have good acuity, like they would have 20/20 vision, or whatever they would normally have. But when they look at objects, it's all just kind of this cluttered mess. They can't really make sense of like where one object ends and the other begins. So they can't really recognize objects even though they can see. So if you have damage to the inferior temporal cortex, that can cause agnosia. It interferes with just basic object recognition. If we keep moving forward in that pathway, especially in the right side of the brain, you'll eventually get to this structure called the fusiform gyrus. So here we have the brain kind of flipped upside down. So this would actually be the right side of the brain. I know it's left here, but that's because the brain's like flipped upside down. So the fusiform gyrus is the part of the brain that in general is responsible for recognizing faces. So someone who has damage to this part of the brain, they will still be able to recognize objects. The world will not look like the picture I just showed you, but they will have a hard time distinguishing faces. Some of the worst cases, so there's like a lot of case studies on people who have prosopagnosia. So there was a woman who had like a stroke in this area of the brain, and she could not recognize her own children. She couldn't tell them apart. She had like two sons, and unless they were standing, because one of them was a lot taller, in that case she could tell, okay, the tall one is whoever, but just looking at their faces, she could not tell them apart. There was even a case, there was a story where like she was at a restaurant, and this might have been a different case, maybe not her, but another person. Whoever it was, they were at a restaurant, they kept looking down the hallway, and every time they would look down the hallway, there was someone staring at them, and like they couldn't figure out what was going on. So they got up and went to confront the person, and it turned out it was a mirror at the end of the hallway, and they were looking at their own face, but they couldn't even recognize their own face because their prosopagnosia was that bad. So they could tell that's a human face, but they can't distinguish them. So one of the things about this part of the brain, though, it's not just for recognizing faces, it's for distinguishing anytime you have two stimuli that are really similar, but they just have slightly subtle differences. So if someone was like a bird watcher, for example, and they're out watching birds and they're trying to identify like two different species of finches or something, and those finches look really similar, and they can tell the difference, then this fusiform face area would be very active in that process. If you're like a car aficionado and you're trying to tell the difference between, I don't know, like a 1968 Mustang and a 1969 Mustang or something, then this part of the brain, again, would be very active for that. These weird little pink figures come from a study, I think they're called greebles is the name that they were given in the study. So they're these little like three-dimensional things, little like they were in a computer, so they're little three-dimensional images made in a computer. And essentially what the researchers did, they had a bunch of participants, they brought them in, they had like 30 of these greebles, and they had the participants try to tell them apart. So every greeble had a name, and they had tested the people on their ability to like match the name to the greeble. When the participants first started, there was no activity in that fusiform gyrus, and their performance was really low. Like they weren't able to do it very well. But then they trained them over 6 weeks. They spent a lot of time looking at these greebles, learning to match the name to the correct greeble. And then at the end of that 6 weeks, they tested them. Their performance was way higher. They were able to do it. And they had lots of activity in that fusiform gyrus while they were making those distinctions. So it's not just for recognizing faces. It's for any time we're trying to tell very similar things apart, trying to distinguish them. So again, all that, pretty good evidence. We have an object recognition system that uses that structural description theory I talked about. And then we'll call it a face recognition system, but just remember it's also for all these other cases that uses that more precise system. Any questions about object recognition?